rather into this subject. Now, before I introduce our first speaker, I just want to say a word or two about how the conference is being organized. I take it that all of you have got programs. As you will know, we have 5 main presentations, each of which will take about 40 minutes, and each presentation will be followed by an invited respondent who will talk about the theme of that presentation for 15 minutes. And then we'll open up a discussion period of about 20 minutes to which you will all be invited to take part. Just one more little technicality. There will be a break of a little over an hour for lunch between 1 or 2, and there'll be, to go into some of the niceties, there will be tea between 4:30 and 4:45. Now, so much for those sides to things. Now, I'd like now to come to introduce our opening speaker, Dr. Deborah Howard, who has been, as I think many of you know, far more a speaker, although she is going to introduce this conference officially. But she has been the prime person behind organizing, and we are enormously grateful to her for all the work that she's done to put this event together, along with Margaret Richardson. Dr. Howard, as you know, I think is a very well-known architectural historian. She's the author of Jacopo Sansovino, Architecture and Patronage in Renaissance Venice, and the Architectural History of Venice. Currently, she's librarian of the Faculty of Architecture and History of Art at Cambridge University, and she is a fellow of St. John's College, Cambridge. Dr. Howard is also a visiting contributor to our graduate school history program here. And her title today is Public Spaces as Settings for Ritual Activity. Dr. Howard.
I'm sorry to shut out the fresh air, but I have to close behind the screen or you won't see anything, I think. That's probably good enough. In his treatise on architecture, Alberti asserted the role of public festivals of Greek and Roman antiquity to, quote, revive and keep up the vigor and fire of the mind, and to improve the strength and intrepidity of the heart. This he justified morally by reference to a biblical precedent. And I quote again from Alberti. Moses was commended for ordaining that his people should, upon certain solemn days, meet together in one temple and celebrate public festivals at stated seasons. What may we suppose his view to have been of such an institution? Asks Alberti. Doubtless he hoped that the people, by thus meeting frequently together at public feasts, might grow more humane and be closer linked in friendship with one another. So I imagine our ancestors instituted public shows in the city not so much for the sake of diversions themselves as for their usefulness. End of quote. Educated Venetians were avid readers of architectural treatises, eagerly studying the beautiful printed editions of Vitruvius, Serlio, and Palladio that rolled off their presses, but they hardly needed books to remind them of the value of public spectacle. Pageantry and ceremonial had been part of Venetian civic life throughout the Middle Ages. Could you put on the projector, please? Or can I do it here? Okay. Right, okay, thanks very much. I hope that's visible. As Edward Muir has pointed out, public festivities in Venice honoured 65 saints' days and 10 movable feasts every year. Into this endlessly repeated religious calendar were inserted the entries of foreign dignitaries and ambassadors, the coronations and funerals of doges, and celebrations of victories and peace treaties. In other words, at least once every 5 days, year in, year out, the city of Venice became the setting for elaborate ritual. The role of ceremonial in explaining and preserving social order has been analysed by historians and anthropologists alike. The political power of ritual depends on the apparently unchanging predictability of each event. The ceremony is ephemeral, preserved only in memory and in ceremonial books. Yet, it gives the illusion of stability precisely because it is remembered. At the same time, the transitory nature of ritual makes it adaptable and flexible. Changes made to procedures are quickly forgotten if they're ever perceived. Thus, the ritual enactment of a stable society can respond to changing political circumstances. Doge Andrea Gritti, who was the Doge from 1523 to 1538, and whom you see a very shadowy view of a beautiful portrait in Washington by Titian, made crucial, much-needed amendments to several public ceremonies. Most notably, the less dignified antics, such as boar chasing, were omitted from the carnival festivities, implicitly to elevate the stature of the Doge who presided over these celebrations. Many of the words we use to describe public spectacle, ritual, ceremonial, procession, reverence, and majesty, are derived both etymologically and conceptually from religious devotional life. In Venice, the political and religious dimensions of public festivities are inextricably knotted together. All the regular festae celebrated feast days of the Catholic Church. Yet the prominence of the Doge and the Signoria in these events underlined the close involvement of the Republic in the religious life of the city. As the mediator between the cosmic order and the social order, the Doge was required to receive minor holy orders to enable him to administer blessings. The quasi-sacred aura of Venetian civic ritual, inherited from Byzantine ceremonial, did not go unnoticed. The French diplomat Philippe de Comines remarked in 1495 that it is the most reverend city I have ever seen in ecclesiastical matters. Ducal processions always began and ended in Piazza San Marco, in which I include the buildings on the piazza. But we should remember that San Marco did not become the Cathedral of Venice until the Napoleonic era. In the days of the Republic, it had a dual function as the Doge's private chapel and the shrine to house the body of St. Mark. Public devotion was focused there, not in the true cathedral of San Pietro di Castello, stranded at the eastern extremity of the city beyond the arsenal. It's way up here, this is where the cathedral is, whereas San Marco, of course, is right in the heart of things. As the Milanese priest, Canon Pietro Cassola, commented ruefully in 1494, the patriarchal church or cathedral is called the Church of San Pietro. It has not many ornaments. I think that St. Mark, who was his disciple, must have stolen them. A public spectacle is a visual manifestation implying the presence of spectators. If we're to understand the nature of civic ritual in Renaissance Venice, we we need to ascertain which social groups made up the intended audience. Engravings and paintings of processions and festivities echo Petrarch's comment that the great square, the church itself, the towers, roofs, porches and windows were not so much filled as jammed with spectators. For elaborately staged events, such as the Giove di Grasso bullfights, which you can see here, temporary seating was erected in tiers in the piazza for privileged ranks of noblemen, and you can see them sitting bolt upright in their grandstands on either side. Petrarch described a similar wooden grandstand erected to accommodate, quotes, 400 young women of the flower of the nobility, very beautiful and splendidly dressed. These women were as much part of the spectacle as they were the spectators, just as in Petrarch's words, early and late they adorned brilliant receptions for invited guests, and adorned is the word rather than attended. A similarly ambiguous role was assigned to the arrays of noble women dressed in sumptuous finery who decorated the upper tier of the Bucintoro, the Doge's state barge, which you can see in the middle of this woodcut, which is done about 1520. For the entry of Anne de Foix into Venice in 1502, 240 noble women in the Bucintoro sparkled with, quotes, diamonds, rubies, emeralds, topazes, pearls and other stones. These women not only enjoyed a privileged vantage point from which to observe the pageantry, but they themselves also played a part in the spectacle. Meanwhile, enormous numbers of Venetians were actively involved in the major public rituals, such as ducal funerals and important feast days. Casola's account of the Feast of Corpus Domini tallies well, both in scope and detail, with the visual evidence of Gentile Bellini's celebrated painting of the procession of St. Mark, signed and dated 1496. According to Casola, each of the 5 scuole grandi was represented by its entire membership, numbering about 500 brethren, all dressed in white habits. And they are, in fact, those of you that know the painting in the Academia of Venice will know that all the way across the front and here and round there are hundreds and hundreds of white-robed figures. The scuole grandi were confraternities which represented the interests of the cittadini, or the burgher class. This is a very schematic diagram, and the figures, of course, are very approximate. But the scuole grandi represent the yellow level in there. Consisting of respectable citizens, such as doctors, lawyers, civil servants, and local merchants. The 2 major festivals, those of Corpus Domini and the Feast of St. Mark, also required the participation of the Scuole delle Arti, or the craft guilds. To these groups, we must add the only group which had direct representation in the democratic, quote, democratic process, that is the patrician class, who of course are at the top of the pyramid. All the top ranks of noble office bearers, down to and including the senators, followed the Doge, who was also accompanied by ambassadors, musicians, standard bearers, the highest cittadini officials, and squires carrying the ducal umbrella, sword, stool, and cushion. You may be able to see, for example, the ducal throne, and come and see it from here, so I expect you'll be able to see it where you are. The crowd management of a great procession had to be perfectly orchestrated if the intended impression of social and political harmony was to be conveyed effectively. Most visitors were impressed by the order and discipline, although Sanudo's diary records several occasions which fell short of the usual clockwork smoothness. At least the Renaissance period did not need the armies of guards pushing back the crowds with batons that we observe in Canaletto's depictions of 18th century festivities. This is not Canaletto, this is Gentile Bellini again, a detail of the same picture. The dualism between participant and spectator cannot be overstressed. Both protagonists and onlookers were the intended audiences, for the ideological content of the rituals. As well as those seated exclusively on barges or grandstands, there were bystanders in the piazza viewing the scene from within the processional space. These included foreign visitors, whether pilgrims, merchants or tourists, and nobles under 25 who were too young to be represented in the Great Council, many of these dressed in the distinctive coloured hose of the Compagnie de la Calza. And you can probably see some of these figures of coloured types on there in the shadows of the picture. Contemporary paintings and engravings show the balconies and windows crammed with spectators, almost exclusively female, watching from the gallery, as it were, and you can see all the women looking out of the windows up there. In 1548, Pietro Aretino sent his little daughter, who was named Adria after the Adriatic Sea, to watch the Giovedì Grasso festivities from the window of his friend, Jacopo Sansovino, the architect and sculptor, who lived in the Procuratie Vecchie beside the clock tower. His apartment is somewhere here, so you can imagine Aretino's little girl sitting up there and watching. We've already mentioned the nobles, the cittadini, and the guildsmen who were actively involved in the public processions, as well as the spectators in and around Piazza San Marco. But it's also important to remember how effectively public ritual crisscrossed the whole fabric of the city. Most obviously, the ducal andate, that is processions to individual churches, followed predetermined routes along streets or waterways, each one to a different destination. More subtly, we must consider the process of assembling these huge crowds of participants. The scuole grandi were spread across the city. By the mid-16th century, there was one in each of the 6 sestieri, or districts, while the membership of each, in turn, was scattered across the city. Each confraternity member, and remember there are 500 roughly members in each one, dressed in his distinctive white robes, had to walk from his home to the scuola to join his fellow fratelli for the procession to the piazza, only to repeat the same process in reverse at the end of the day. Thus, on a major feast day, between 2,000 and 3,000 white-robed figures could be seen scuttling through the streets of Venice, purposefully but individually, like ants, visible to all social classes from windows or street corners. The audience, in other words, was everybody, everywhere. The very fabric of Venice conveyed an impression of unreality. Charles Dickens wrote in a letter of 1844, "Opium couldn't build such a place, and enchantment couldn't shadow it forth in a vision." Visitors arrived by boat, lulled into disbelief by the horizon bobbing up and down around them, and the reflections of buildings shimmering in the water like mirages. Thus, the vital role of the architecture in the civic spaces was to convey a sense of anchorage and solidity. To fulfill its stabilizing role, civic ritual had to be believable and not evanescent and chimerical. Before we consider the architectural character of the civic spaces of Venice, it's necessary to recall the implications of Venice's unique physical setting. In the first place, any impression of architectural stability has to conceal the fact that even the buildings of Venice float on rafted platforms pegged into the wet mud by shifting sands by forests of wooden piles, and this is just a diagram of the piling process. Secondly, since the terrain is effectively man-made by reclamation of the lagoon marshes, land is costly and scarce. Yet Francesco Sansovino, as the son of the architect, boasted that there was enough public space in Venice to accommodate another complete city. The abundance of open space in itself asserted civic power, for it implied the dominance of authority over private interest. Thirdly, Venice was one of the very few cities that could be entered in the very heart of the city. During the 16th century, most Italian towns were encircled with star-shaped ramparts and bastions, which embraced their more picturesque medieval fortifications. Except for imposing gates such as San Michele's Verona portals, these cities presented an inhospitable face to the visitor. Their peripheries were unsightly earthworks, with straggling suburbs clustered outside the gates. By contrast, wherever one disembarked in Venice, the city was permeable and welcoming. Fourthly, the permeability of the city penetrated the whole townscape by means of the overlapping networks of streets and waterways. Every prominent building or open space could be viewed from a boat or a bridge or a quay. The corollary is that those on the boats, bridges or quays could themselves be observed by those watching from windows, balconies or rooftop altane. Even private palaces were penetrated by the public gaze, especially at night when they appeared like photographic negatives with their huge windows lit by glittering Murano glass chandeliers. If anybody has any photos of Venice at night, do let me know, because I'm looking for them. I mean, I suppose this is the next best thing. I'm now going to look at the role of architecture as processional scenery. Apart from the two state icon buildings, that is San Marco and the Palazzo Ducale, almost the whole of Piazza San Marco was rebuilt during the 16th century. The basic formula for the buildings that framed the piazza had been inherited from the 12th and 13th century structures, which in turn, as Jürgen Schultz has shown in a recent article, depended heavily on the precedence of Constantinople. It's a very schematic symbol, if you like, of Constantinople there. This is important, for it reminds us that there was a direct inheritance from antiquity, sustained since Roman times in the Eastern Empire. We've already mentioned the influence of Byzantine ceremonial on Venetian state ritual, directly transmitting to Venice the ancient love of public display, which was lauded by Alberti, as we saw at the beginning. In his study of the architecture of the Roman Empire, William MacDonald concluded that two main characteristics distinguished ancient Roman imperial buildings. That's imperial as opposed to republican. One was the proliferation of columns, often without regard to logical necessity, and the other was the elaboration and three-dimensionality of the wall surface. Both these elements are crucial to the articulation and decoration of Piazza San Marco, from the copious displays of costly marble columns on the facade of San Marco itself to the richly sculptured chiaroscuro of Sansovino's library, which you see there, and just to remind you of the character of the three-dimensional surface, this is a detail of the frieze at the top of the building. Moreover, we can infer from contemporary accounts that more specific imperial symbols were recognized in the setting of the piazza. Such interpretations were derived by analogy with Constantinople and ancient Rome, reinforced by literary and numismatic studies. Above all, the bronze horses rearing triumphantly above San Marco bore associations of empire which, if not historically accurate, were nonetheless easily understood. And here is a coin from the time of the Emperor Nero with four horses on the top of a triumphal arch. Depictions of ducal processions show clearly the role of the architectural setting in articulating public ceremonial. Matteo Pagan's fine series of 8 woodcuts of the procession of the Doge on Palm Sunday dates from the late 1550s, eloquently express the symbiosis between fixed and moving components. In the foreground, we observe, from the viewpoint of the bystander in the piazza, the solemn train of civic dignitaries. Their pace is slowed by their bulky togas, bearing appropriate connotations of academic learning and religious devotion. These figures are framed by the measured rhythm of the arcades of the Procuratie Vecchie, their solid piers emphasizing the impression of stability and classical authority. By contrast, the rhythm of the windows above is more rapid and its forms more slender, framing the animated female spectators at the upper balconies. The presence of fixed scenery, marked off in units of measurement, allows one to assess the progress of moving processions. Furthermore, the repeatable bay system of the piazza's enclosing buildings hints at the constant replication that is the very essence of civic ritual. It was the achievement of the 16th century to give a third dimension to public ritual space. As John O'Nions has pointed out, it was not until after 1490 that the piazzetta was shown with the space as the central focus of the perspective. Earlier views had depicted the scene with the Doge's palace taking centre stage. This is a plate from the Nuremberg Chronicle of 1493, where, the perspective is not entirely accurate, but the central point of the perspective is here, not in the space. This self-conscious shift of emphasis reveals a growing interest in perspective as a tool for articulating and representing the townscape, as well as an appreciation of the symbolic value of open space itself. The same viewpoint, from a point in the bacino exactly halfway between the two columns, dominates Jacopo de Barbari's celebrated bird's eye view map of Venice completed in 1500. And you can see that here the perspective is not centered on the Palazzo Ducale, the Doge's palace itself, but on the space to the left of it. As early as 1486, Mauro Caduci had apparently anticipated this shift in viewpoint when he provided stone bases for the three flagpoles in front of San Marco, exactly aligned when seen from between the two great columns of the piazza. So this is the way they're lined up, and I'll show you how that looks. If you stand between the columns, you see how you can only see one pole because they're all in a line. It was in the time of Doge Andrea Gritti that the full possibilities of the perspective setting of the piazza were exploited. By Sansovino in his series of new buildings for the procurators of San Marco, and in parallel by Sebastiano Serlio in the early volumes of his treatise on architecture. Sansovino had learned from Bramante how to use perspective to foreshorten or extend the apparent dimensions of a space. The success of such manipulation depends on the way that we assume spaces framed by orthogonal structures to be rectangular. I gather from psychological studies in perception and so on that if one put somebody who's only ever lived in a round hut in an African tribal village in Piazza San Marco, this would not work for them. I mean, it's the fact that we assume that rooms and spaces are rectangular. Thus, converging sides make a space appear deeper, a familiar theatrical device. And just to remind you, the sort of thing, this is Palladio's Teatro Olimpico, where you have the idea of an extremely long street behind the proscenium arch there. The same effect in reverse, that is to say, diverging sides, brings the background closer to the spectator. This situation was already present in the piazzetta, viewed from between the great columns. By this means, San Marco and the Campanile were brought closer to the viewer, and the sighting of the new clock tower, begun in 1496 to close this perspective, affirmed the heightened awareness of this effective device. So, in other words, this space already opened up. Buildings were just set at that angle. The alignment of the flagpoles
exactly framing the clock tower in the background suggests a conscious awareness of that as a similar space. And actually, the flagpoles are not in quite the right place in this diagram, which comes from Lotz's article on Italian public spaces. It was Sansovino who, after 1537, realigned the south side of the main piazza to create the same trapezoidal form, bringing San Marco apparently closer to the viewer. So you see what happened before Sansovino's time. The buildings went right the way up to the Campanile like that, almost parallel to the buildings on the other side. And he, by determining that the corner should go there, realigned them from there down to there, so that this space also opens up when you stand here, brings San Marco apparently closer to you, because you read this as a rectangular space. And the same effect, conversely, gives the illusion of greater size to the little church of San Gimignano, which faced it at the opposite end of the great open space. The church has been demolished, and I'm showing you the mock-up that was put up in 1980 at the time of the Palladio celebrations, which gives an impression of its size at least, and makes it look indeed much bigger than it actually was. In the hands of Sansovino, Gritti's Renovatio succeeded in transforming the centre of Venice from a chaotic medley resembling Serlio's comic scene, which will be familiar to all of you, I'm sure, to a setting of unified classical dignity, more like his tragic scene. Even the boat's eye view of these imaginary stage sets, as it were, provided with steps on which to disembark, seems to assert their relevance to Venice. Serlio was to provide Venice with the theoretical basis for the understanding of the subtle use of orders in the piazza. That the theoretical analogy was ever present in Serlio's mind is implied by his description of the 5 orders as the dramatis personae of his narrative. The importance of lighting should not be underrated. Within buildings, lighting can be relatively easily controlled. For instance, a photograph of the interior of San Marco, taken by natural light in the afternoon, clearly shows that the choir behind the iconostasis, the part occupied during ceremonial masses by the Doge and Signoria, is much brighter than the rest of the space, like a stage in front of a darker auditorium. The illumination of open-air ceremonies, viewed in the round by peripatetic spectators and performed by moving participants, is harder to manipulate. Nonetheless, it is noteworthy that the prospect enjoyed by the distinguished visitor entering the piazzetta by day between the great columns is fully illuminated from the sun behind, just as the audience occupied the north side of an ancient Roman theatre. Equally felicitous is the exact alignment of the shadow of the campanile across the face of the clock tower at noon, and that was taken exactly as the bells were ringing for midday, so you can see that it actually it works accurately. The steady progression of the shadow of the campanile around the piazza during the course of the day must have provided an emotive symbol of the domination of authority over the ostensibly classless public space. So you see, when the sun rises in the east, the shadow of the clock tower begins round there, and then gradually during the day it moves round, and then at midday it's exactly there, and during the rest of the day it completes the circle of the piazza. Finally, and I'm sorry this looks very corny, but I promise it's a genuine photograph, one should mention the theatrical effect of the winter sunset igniting the gilded mosaics of the facade of San Marco. The punctuation of the processional route by significant stage props, such as pairs of columns and triumphal arches, was both visual and symbolic. The use of markers to indicate the limits of a leaking space is effective, both in the paired columns at the seaward end of the piazzetta and
in the row of flagpoles dividing the piazza from the piazzetta and defining the semi-sacred space in front of San Marco. But these are not merely picturesque framing elements. They also carry iconographic significance on two levels. In the first place, the bronze reliefs on Leopardi's flagpole bases, which were installed in 1505, are adorned with explicit patriotic imagery, easily understandable by the spectator of the time. The protective figures, can't see them, but they're there, of St. Mark and St. Theodore atop the great columns perform a similar role. However, one should also consider the more oblique, signifying role of the architectural forms themselves, as opposed to the iconographic content of the sculpture that's on them. Paired columns were a symbol of justice, by analogy with the two great bronze columns outside the biblical temple and palace of Solomon. They were also a metaphor for imperial power, exemplified by the columns of Trajan and Marcus Aurelius in Rome, which during this period were provided with statues of St. Peter and Paul, and by the colossal columns of Constantinople. The analogy with the paired columns adopted by Emperor Charles V as his impresa can hardly have escaped notice in 16th century Venice. In a similar vein, John O'Neill suggested an allusion in the placing of the three standard bases to the rows of flagpoles in front of ancient Roman images of imperial battle encampments. Triumphal arches carried a comparable range of associations. From the purely scenographic point of view, a series of arches framed and articulated the ducal processional route from the Doge's private apartments in here to the left and out there into the piazza. From the triple arch at the top of the Scala dei Giganti, through the Arco Foscari, I'm sure we're going to hear more about this, so I'm going very quickly on here, to Sansovino's Loggetta at the foot of the Campanile, which is what faces you as you come out. All these monuments are arrayed with sculpture expressing overtly patriotic themes. But their spatial and more elusive architectural significance must also be stressed. The Loggetta, like the arches of Constantine and Septimus Severus in Rome, marked a right-angled turn in the processional sequence. This is the Arch of Constantine. That the triumphal associations were known throughout Europe is clear from the numerous temporary arches erected for 16th century ceremonial entries into cities. Venice, this is one of the arches put up for the entry of Philip II into Antwerp in 1549. Venice made these ephemeral festive decorations into permanent fixtures, fixed scenery. As if to underline the triumphal possibilities of all'antica Roman architectural forms, Flavio Biondo's De Roma Triumphante was reissued in a Venetian edition in 1511, the same year as the publication in Venice of Fra Giocondo's illustrated edition of Vitruvius. The ducal procession was known in Venice as Andar in Trionfo. Even foreigners could hardly fail to respond to the expression of triumph. Philippe de Comines' reaction, this is the French diplomat I've already mentioned, in 1494 was typical in its sentiment, but unusually specific in its wording. It is the most triumphant city that I have ever seen, and the one which gives most honour to ambassadors and foreigners, and which is the most wisely governed, and where the service of God is most solemnly made. It remains to consider the role of water in enhancing public spectacle. The state barge, the Bucintoro, was smoother and less noisy than a processional carriage, and much more splendid than a sedan chair. Heavy, elaborate carnival floats could be easily transported, literally afloat, around the city. Water was even of use to the spectators, who could watch the festivities from the privacy of a covered gondola, as if in a box at the theatre. And you can see, for example, one here, one here. It was during the Renaissance period that the importance of the Grand Canal as a grand ceremonial route was first recognised. The banks were straightened and reinforced, and the palaces were extended forwards to create a continuous urban frontage. The bends in the canal displayed an ever-unfolding spectacle to the visitor, offering a backdrop of richly adorned, delicately traceried facades rather than a recession into depth. I mean, it's obvious, I think, to anybody who's been down the Grand Canal that it never just recedes into the distance. You always see buildings at the end of every prospect. Wherever you're looking, you always have an architectural backdrop. The use of the Fondaco dei Turchi, which is an ancient Byzantine palace up at the top end of the Grand Canal here, as the most favoured lodging for important state guests in the 16th century, ensured that the whole length of the canal was incorporated into the festive scenery of the city. A contemporary observer described the visit of the Duke of Ferrara in 1572 as follows: "One cannot be silent about the noble, joyous spectacle of the windows of the many palaces along the Grand Canal, all hung with the finest carpets and full of most beautiful matrons and esteemed men, gaily watching the arrival of the Duke." Now, obviously, this is Canaletto, not in 1572, but in the 18th century. But I think you can see the same thing, that all the balconies got carpets hanging out and people all dressed up, watching all the way along. Once again, we encounter the complex dualism between the observer and the observed. The visiting grandees see and admire the Venetians at their windows, while they, in turn, watch the aquatic procession. In other words, everybody's watching everybody else. And just to sum up, state ritual in Venice was an elaborate means of demonstrating the social and political order of the Republic to the widest possible audience. In her recent study of ceremonial entries into Venice, Patricia Fortini Brown records a minor but pertinent detail in the reception of 4 Japanese princes in 1582. On a platform in the piazza stood a figure of Venetia, described as a young woman dressed nobly and very richly with jewels. 6 members of the Scuole Grandi knelt in front of her, asking what they must do. She gave her response in the form of a motto written in large letters: "Servate praecepta," meaning observe the rules. Just as the participants were expected and even directed to observe the rules, so too the architecture became more and more academically correct as the 16th century advanced. By the end of the century, in the opinion of Scamozzi, even the Roman-style classicism of Sansovino was too undisciplined. In Renaissance Venice, rituals and their settings acted out a visual dialogue in time and space, each dependent on the other. Contradictions and their visible resolution were the essence of Venetian public spectacle. A paradox is implicit in the words of the German pilgrim Felix Faber in 1484. Such are the enjoyments of the solemnities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now want to introduce our first respondent. This is Dr. Philip Tabor. He's an architect, trained in Cambridge, where he did his doctorate, and he's now head of the Bartlett School. Has a very special interest in Venice. Dr. Tabor.
Thank you very much. I'll just give us some more light, because I'm not using slides. I'm not actually head of the Bartlett School, but I am Director of Architectural Studies there. And I think perhaps more important for today, I'm the Chief Debt Collector for the Venetian Studies journal News on the Rialto. £4 a year. Very good value. See me afterwards. Well, Deborah is an impossible act to follow. Her usual debonair scholarship has illuminated the vivacity of an historical scene without floodlighting it anachronistically with the unnatural glare of the 20th century. But at the same time, for me at least, she threw into startled relief certain aspects of medieval and Renaissance Venice, which, thus illuminated, reflect back onto our own times. During Deborah's paper, for instance, I was reminded of 1979, and during that rather hot summer there appeared in the bacino, the stretch of water which doorsteps the piazzetta, a raft on which was a tall building, a timber-clad, multi-story, octagonal tower. It was taken over to the customs house, the Dogana d'Armar, where it tied up, and it closely resembled in form Giuseppe Mezzani's Toy Town stone lighthouse, which you see about 500 meters away across the water, just outside San Giorgio Maggiore. But the architect of this tower, Aldo Rossi, claimed that its immediate precedents were the centralized clapboard lighthouses of the New Hampshire coast. Now, in plan, section, and indeed elevation, the tower appeared artless, even banal. The details were skimpy and crude. But its temporary nature and its instability floating on the water evoked a quality which Venice once had but has lost, and I'd like to return to that later. Rossi called his tower Il Teatro del Mondo, the theatre of the world, and inside the tower was a tiny theatrical stage. In Renaissance Venice, of course, Il Teatro del Mondo was the name given to a kind of floating grandstand, a roofed loggia, circular or polygonal in plan, which on festive occasions was rowed ceremonially along the Grand Canal. The illustration I know is of 1610, a woodcut by Giacomo Franco, but there are many others, and I believe the teatro came in many architectural guises. Now, much has been written about the Renaissance Teatro del Mondo, its symbolic density as a kind of mnemonic microcosm. But at its simplest allegoric level, it is a metaphor of the city as Venice saw itself. Venice as an auditorium, or perhaps a lighthouse, at the center of civilization, from which it gazes out to survey and illuminate the exterior world. And Venice is the world stage with an all-star cast upon which the rest of the world gazes in with jealous admiration. Now, act out this Janus-faced metaphor in the street theatre of Venetian ceremony, and Deborah's repeated emphasis is confirmed. The spectators are also actors, the actors also spectators. Deborah showed us Gentile Bellini's great painting of the Corpus Christi procession, and I think this illustrates this with lively precision. Bang in the middle of the piazza, while a cast of thousands dressed in white do their solemn thing around them, a kind of loose crowd of businessmen chat away with self-conscious ease, while young fashion statements adopt elegant postures and offer their best profiles to the scene. The picture also supports Deborah's judgment, reinforced by literary records, that Venice was particularly apt to blur the boundaries between religious and everyday experience, and by extension between the forms of religious and of civil ceremony. Now, if this was so, what was the main political purpose of Venetian ritual and display? Was it the often assumed function of ceremony and theatre to score into the secular body, inclined to formlessness, sharp lines between phases of life, between sacred and profane experience, between the rulers and the ruled? Or was it, on the contrary, to soften such distinctions by regularly injecting every part of that body, 5 days a week, was it, Deborah? 1 in 5 days, with a dose of unifying sacred drama? If we believe the former, that ceremony's ideological purpose is to enforce a hierarchy between the more and the less powerful, then Venice, the society of the spectacle, if ever there was one, deserved that phrase's sinister modern connotation. According to this critique, the city of commodities and total theatre is a glamorous but corrosive lie, fatally corrosive. Myth and its sidekick ritual predetermine all individual action and experience. Convention and ceremony allow the rulers to manipulate the ruled like puppets in a theatre. And spectacle and display so drug the ruled with illusions of freedom and omnipotence that, unable to see the rising tide of corruption and obsolescence, the city loses its ability to adapt, invent, and revolt. Are there echoes, I wonder, in recent times? Ultimately, to continue this modish hypothesis, signs drive out significance, and spectacle becomes more real than reality itself. At that point, we surrender all hope of acting upon the world and any desire to do so. We live out an endless carnival. We wake up in Disneyland. Well, there I've mentioned the D word, and I think it was bound to happen sooner or later, given the subject of today's colloquium. And certainly, I think anyone who has known Venice over the last 2 or 3 decades will attest to its gradual, if genteel, Disneyfication. I once heard an old resident mourning the replacement of her local dairy and grocer shop by souvenir mask shops. One cannot eat masks, she complained. Well, in Venice, perhaps we can and do eat masks. This leads me to put an optimistic spin on this phenomenon. Let's take the other supposition, that in medieval and Renaissance Venice, ritual transfigured all aspects of the commonplace. We might then infer a ubiquity of ceremony in Venetian life, a continuous gradient of theatricality from the comic to the tragic scene, beginning with the intimate formalities of domestic life, and then ascending in regularity, formality and sanctity through the common courtesies of the street, the customary melodramas of the market, festive games and entertainments, judicial punishments and processions, to the pomp and circumstance of the great religious and civic pageants. Contrast this with Richard Sennett's bleakly persuasive picture of modern social life. In our dealings with each other, in vain pursuit of personal authenticity, Sennett says that we have discarded the persona, the actor's mask, and for the most part abandoned courtesies, ritual gestures, and the formats of objective discourse. Individually, therefore, we can no longer tap the creative strength of the actor to play with and invest feeling in external images of self and make art out of daily life. Politically, in our preference for personalities rather than personae, debate dwindles to solipsism, party, and partisanship. Sennett argues that in pre-modern times, however, communal life flourished most vigorously in those cities where the conventions of the playhouse, its rhetoric and choreography, governed the public manners of street and tavern. Deborah's paper has now vividly exposed the machinery of architecture, light, street layout and topography, which made Venice the ideal stage set for such an all-inclusive urban drama. Much of that physical machinery remains in position and still works to convince stubbornly secular souls like mine that as we take coffee in a campo or process around the piazza's arcades, Venice presents a luminous, if cloudy, vision of Sennett's as yet unfulfilled hope for a modern city which is also a theatre of public life. That's why I'm glad that 6 million visitors a year are exposed, however briefly, to this vision. But for all its beauty and charm, Venice has not a civilized and historic centre as it should have, for either its residents, its thousands of inward commuters, or its visitors. Architectural rearrangement, architectural amplification is necessary. But how? I think a clue lies in the fact that Venice in the days of the Republic, and to some extent till only a few decades ago, had two architectures cohabiting side by side. One, a solid architecture of brick and stone, albeit on timber piles, as Deborah has shown, and on the other hand, a usually less permanent architecture of wood, iron, canvas and rope. On one hand, an architecture which is blood related to the earth, on the other hand, an architecture akin to air, fire, and significantly, of course, water. Of the architecture of wood, iron, canvas, and rope, remarkably few examples survive today, perhaps because of a kind of municipal tidy-mindedness. They include the pontoon causeway, which is thrown across the Giudecca Canal for the Feast of the Redeemer, the Academia Bridge, as rebuilt, the greengrocers' barges moored by San Barnabas, the rather Parisian sheet metal newspaper kiosk in the Campo Santo Stefano, the wooden ice cream hut near Santa Maria Formosa, a type of cross-braced carpentered balustrade called Palladian, found on some landing stages, the steel-framed water bus stops, and of course folding sunshades over cafe tables. All decent enough, I suppose, but taken together unimpressive in quantity and quality. But, as Deborah's slides have shown, the woodcuts and the paintings of ducal ceremonies in the Correa Museum, the great True Cross and St. Ursula cycles in the Academia galleries, the Canalettos and the Guardis in our own National Gallery, and 1,000 ceremonial genre and topographic pictures, even pre-war photographs, all show as a major element in the Venetian urban scene this spiky, flapping architecture of wood and canvas, its marine technology and intransient air contrasting intensely with the other masonry architecture and breathing life into it. I refer not only to the grand temporary Potemkin villages of canvas and stucco, the floating Teatro del Mondo itself, of course, Palladio's Triumphal Arch and the Loggia at the Lido to celebrate Henry III's arrival, the elaborate edicule which Deborah showed floating at the Volta da Canal in the Canaletto picture, Bernardino Macarucci's Festa del Censo temporary market colonnade in the piazza, or the Triumphal Arch once set in the canal near where the station now is to frame Napoleon's entry. I refer also to more utilitarian structures, like the hideous machinery of the Strappado, erected in the piazza to put prisoners ceremonially to the question, to gallows and scaffolds, to the iron prison cage suspended from the loggia of St. Mark's Campanile, to the forest of masts, spars, sailcloth and rigging, which Venice lost really comparatively recently, and my own late 19th century favourites, a huge tombola pavilion set up in the piazza, and a wooden swimming pool which floated just outside the piazzetta in the bacino. Paintings and woodcuts, as we've seen, show processions protected by long awnings on poles. Campi busy with market stalls, mountebank stages, lean-to shacks and flagpoles. Skylines bristle with derricks, odd fishing rod devices for drying clothes on, and of course altane, those flimsy, unroofed wooden aerial platforms. People gaze down from roofed but open-sided timber loggias. Balconies are upholstered with fine carpets as well as by fine ladies, and facades are enlivened by dozens of projecting canopies and shades. It is this lightweight, demountable, nomadic, Tiepolesque architecture, the sticks of Venice, if you like, rather than the stones, which might help modern Venice civilize its urban environment and respond to its huge seasonal changes in population without violating the priceless fabric of its masonry architecture. It would share with us our mobility and our body's constant flexing between compression and tension, and thus, like furniture, or indeed Deborah's beautiful matrons at windows, act as a kind of reconciliatory go-between between soft humanity and the city's stones. It would also restore to the Venetian visual scene the traditional balance and complementarity between its two architectures. Just one last point. In a particularly perceptive and I think original section of her paper, Deborah drew attention to the importance of lighting in Venetian scenography. I don't have for Deborah a slide of Venice at night, but I do know a wonderful print, I think it was of ceremonies of welcome in 1782, when the exterior of every building in the piazza was starred with innumerable candles and lanterns. It must have been a spectacular eyeful. Or perhaps Venice's new architecture could be light in both senses, accommodating the technologies of information and our corresponding late 20th century sensibility for luminous ethereality. We might find our own equivalent to the strangely tangible light which densifies both interior and exterior space in the paintings of Bellini, Mansueto, and Carpaccio, a light which modern Venice has quite lost. We shouldn't, of course, allow historical study to draw us completely into a past, for in doing so we would forsake a world we can act in and on our own for one in which we can't. But a study like Deborah's, which keeps its historical distance but analyzes the mechanisms of the past with acute sensibility, will always, not necessarily overtly, point at possible futures. That's a neat trick, I think, and a very great virtue. Thank you.
Well, we're open to questions, to the discussion with our speakers. Anyway, ready to start the question. Maybe I would just sort of raise up a little question as a starting point. I wondered whether we might be able, even historically, to pinpoint some of the beginnings of this very strong sort of ceremoniality that takes place in such a conspicuous way. Historically, what kind of are the things that we can put our finger to and say, look, these are some beginnings, and because it goes in such a conspicuous way, and clearly this tradition gets set up, and it becomes such a powerful tradition. Is there any way we can account for any of it, or would that be a study in its own right, not yet conducted?
I mean, I don't have an answer. It's a terribly good question, because if one says that one of the functions of some of the ceremonial, particularly the andate, was to, as it were, mark out space, like sort of dogs peeing at a corner, then there must have been some time when, I suppose in pre-Republican times, when Venice has an aggregation of islands changed geographically to a more consolidated centre, when space, the nature of space and how space was inhabited and experienced changed, and therefore the function of ceremonial with regard to that space might have changed too.
Well, I mean, obviously, as presumably most people will know here, Edward Muir's book called Civic Ritual in Renaissance Venice is absolutely instrumental in charting the beginnings of these things, and the Byzantine roots are very, very strong. There are certain political moments where, I mean, perhaps I should call on the Venetian colleagues really to help me out here. There are certain political moments where, for various reasons, Venice needed to assert itself. I mean, I think most people would probably agree that the tremendous revival of ritual and the improvement of ritual in the time of Doge Greti was following a period of great crisis in the Republic, where certainly there was a terrific need to reassert morale and so on. And it's interesting that, you know, these periods of sort of intense ritual activity seem to follow each time a kind of crisis in the fortunes of Byzantine Empire itself. The Fourth Crusade in 1204 and the fall of Constantinople in 1453, as if Venice is almost consciously trying to inherit and rework this, because it was Byzantine ceremonial was regarded as a direct legacy from antiquity. So really, imperial traditions had sort of been preserved there and insulated from outside forces over this extremely long period of 1,000 years. And Venice, I think, regarded itself as the heir. Does that answer your question?
It certainly opens it up.
Adventure remark. Deborah didn't say very much about Venice at night, except she had got pictures of it. But it seems to me there was one occasion in the year in which exemplifies the sorts of things she's been saying, as the fireworks on the Bacino, Caragosto. Because obviously you have a great stage there, and you have a great audience standing on the river edge of the audience. But there are more subtle comparisons that it makes. Because if you're knowledgeable, or if you have knowledgeable Italian friends, you get to sit in one of the cafes or something on the river, and you get a splendid view, and you're surrounded by all the other knowledgeable Italians or friends of Italians, elegant ladies, dressed for the evening out, and you are indeed part of the participation as well as part of the audience. At least there's that one continuity in the life of Venice and those who come to it?
Well, my point about the night actually is a serious one, because even if, and always when I go to Venice, it's winter and it's cold nowadays, because I don't like going in the summer anymore, despite the pleasures of living because it's so busy. And the thought of going out at night with your tripod and taking photographs, I've just never done it, because not enough of the palaces are inhabited to make it worth it. I mean, I think what we can't imagine now is what it was like when every one of these palaces was inhabited permanently on every floor, so that at night time virtually every window would be lit up. And no matter how many nights I had spent on the banks of the canal with my tripod in freezing weather, I would never recover this complete photographic negative, which must have been the spectacle of Venice in this period. I mean, one couldn't possibly reconstruct the situation.
Just one point, it was reconstructed at the Carnival in 92, I think, when the civic authorities gave every palace on the Grand Canal a candle to burn in their window. They were obliged. But it had been there at the tripod on that particular night. You could have seen. I saw it, but I didn't have a candle. There is another point, if I might ask. Surely pictures like the Gentile Bellini were made for a specific purpose, which isn't for us. It was for the Scuola Grande that was commissioned from Tabor, which was to show the Scuola performing its duties and to make its particular relic very important. It's like it's a question how reliable a document it was. It's really a Scuola document which tells us that Scuola's relic was considered important.
Yes, well, I mean, I take your point completely, but because, it does, as you say, have a very special reason. Nonetheless, I think that it performed its function by virtue of the fact of giving an impression of realism. That although realism could be transformed, and was in certain ways, like slightly moving the campanile because it was inconveniently in the way of the Doge's palace, slightly moving it to the right. But because everything was done in such minute detail so that everybody could recognize the reality of it, it was therefore better able to express, the miracle that's being shown in it. And in a sense, the miracle is subsumed into this vision of all-encompassing sort of realism down to the minutest detail. And I think it's like the Barbary map. If you show everything with completely believable fine detail, even when you're not being truthful, people will believe you. I think that's the subtle point about that series. That these miracles, the whole lot, become believable because every place is recognizable and identifiable down to the particular, washing hanging on the roof, whatever it might be. Therefore, you're convinced even by the unreal that's in it. Does that make sense?
Yes. I think if you want to photograph candle power, you might go to that old Venetian college in Corfu on Easter Saturday night, where everyone goes to the service on the cricket green, and they carry the candle home. And the green has arcaded facades, and in fact the total area is lit by something like 20,000 candles, and you can photograph that. It's sufficiently, 20,000 candle power is quite something. And you would have got that in the square at Main Square in Venice, at least.
Professor Conchino, did you put up your hand?
I appreciated very much of the interpretation given by Deborah to the slide showing the interior of St. Mark from the apse through the iconostase and the role played by light there. And my question is, I found interesting to observe that perhaps St. Mark has a second iconostasis. I mean, the facade. Becoming an iconostasis through the generation of the 14th century mosaics to the conventional point of view. We don't have a wall, but you want something like a mediation, a pictorial mediation, from what? From place interpretation that we can interpret as a nave and some mark as interior. So we could consider from this point of view, that's the question, the nave as the sacred space of the Epiphany, ducal Epiphany.
So the nave would be the piazza?
Yeah.
Yes. And
if you look
yeah.
to the passage is not a Byzantine wall, but an iconostasis. It projects toward the exterior the iconographical themes of the interior. Remember, for example, the manuscript showing the side of the Apostolian and Byzance, and not showing really the church, but the projection of the interior mosaics. I think that something similar happened in the 13th century Venice, exactly with the idea to create the mediation of the icons, brackets, from place starting to be born, 14th century, and interior.
Yes. Well, I mean, you can't sort of prove it either way, at least I can't, but I mean, I think that's a very important point. I mean, I've often thought that, you know, that the piazza functioned rather like an early Christian forecourt or atrium in front of a church. I mean, it feels very like that, and I think that's very important to regard it actually as a nave. I mean, there is a new theory which you may have come across by an English archaeologist that there was actually an atrium where the nave is now. I don't know if you've seen that article. So, maybe the author's here, I don't know. And, you know, which would take things one remove further from that. But, and obviously the point is that San Marco is very unusual as a Byzantine building in having so much decoration on the outside, which does perforce incorporate the external space into the sacred arena, I think. I would agree with that.
Yeah, how far can one say that the ritual or the downfall of Venice in terms of having the Disneyfication, how far can one say that Venice, when the word of rituals and all the districts were involved, has sort of enhanced its own downfall as such, as comparatively to London, for instance, where ritual took place on the water as well. You know, Lord Mayor show was on the water and all of that. But nevertheless, London has not fallen into that trap, becoming a complete Disney world. This apart from socio-economic factors.
Yes, I suppose it is my question. I was the guy asking the rhetorical question. I'm not expecting that to answer. I think the particular status of Venice now as a kind of centre of fantasy, the particular way in which Venice is used by most of its visitors, does make one ask questions about the role of ceremonial in Venice's, particularly in pre-19th century, ceremonial in pre-19th century Venice. I don't know whether or not the Venetians themselves truly felt that when they acted out these charades and pageants, that they were truly participating in something which did have an authenticity which went back to Byzantine times, or whether or not it was something hyped up in committee rooms and reinvented year after year, primarily for the benefit of visitors and the room. I don't know, perhaps someone else who who knows far more than I do about that period, will be able to tell us. But clearly, I think we shouldn't take necessarily at face value contemporary claims that the ceremonies had an historic authenticity and were seen by all the participants in that way. Whether or not, I'm just banking. I think we have to ask the question whether or not the sheer amount of ceremony, the sheer amount of self-regarding ritual which Venice indulged in, might in some way have prevented it from seeing its economic and political decline and acting rather faster than it might. Or whether we might say in some deterministic way that as soon as the Atlantic powers had got their trade routes together, Venice was doomed as a serious contending international contender. But I think it's a question one should ask. So I guess we should go anywhere.
What I saw you Richard Guy. Thank you very much. Okay, well, we're going to move on